Hello, welcome to this episode of What If Michael or Jimmy never were there to help the world? So, I wanted to do a What If episode because, you know, it's an interesting, you know, thing to think about. Like, what if something didn't have, a certain character, or, what if things went different? What if our own lives were, different from how they currently are? Like, what if, of many different things, but this one's, gonna be mainly focused on my characters. So let's head way, way back to Michael's origins. So if he didn't exist, well, then I guess the Book of Lies would have had to focus on Jimmy instead when he would be eventually born. But by that point, it was, years and years later, like, at that point, you know, like, worth there even being a chance? Like, if Jimmy was taken out of the equation, like it mean a lot more work for Michael, but he may have still been able to handle things, you know, still being able to handle things, just he would have had to do a lot more heavy lifting. But if Michael is gone, that means like his canonical birth was, I'm just trying to remember, 18, no, not 18, 19, there we are, 89, I believe. Um, so, yeah, I think that was his canonical year of birth. Um, so, without him, that means like the Foundation will never need to worry about him, so they would never need to worry about him and potentially being more focused on other things. So without Michael, like, it would have been potentially a lot more of a deadly world. Like, the Foundation would still rule. Um, There'd still be the Illuminati, the League of Villains, like all that stuff would have never been taken down. And when not whether not certain other events like our birth cycle went on or not, I guess it won't matter. Like it meant that Michael would never be there for Jimmy when he was born, and Michael is the main reason Jimmy like gained his kindness, like because you know Michael was one of the few people that actually cared about Jimmy during his times where he was being experimented on. So without Michael to be that light in his life, Jimmy could have become a lot more like cynical and potentially evil, exactly what the Scarlet Queen would have wanted. And obviously, without Michael, the Scarlet Queen never becomes good. So it's a case of without Michael, so many enemies and evils would have never became good. Mikkel would have never turned good. You know, you know, Oliver, where he enters the picture, not Oliver Bane. Um, he will never turn good. Other great evils, the Foundation could potentially been ruined or wrecked, like, by multiple dangerous things, like, and I'm sure the Scarlet Queen would have been crafty enough, and the Book of Lies trying to do things on their own would be like an impossible task for them, especially with the Foundation hunting them, which, was the reason why they had to hide so much. So, you know, without Michael, it basically be a whole new world, a lot darker world. Without Michael, things would be terrible. You know, there'd be less consequence of losing Jimmy. Like, you know, if it wasn't, Jimmy doing it, it'd probably be, the Master Chief, Master Chief would have been, in his place, so yeah, like honestly, like things would have changed too much without Jimmy, but without Michael, God, it'd be chaos, you know, absolute chaos, and probably death for a lot of people. Not to mention, other characters be affected as well, like all the people that came from like the alternate timeline, like Axel, um, um, Zale, um, the alternate timeline of Ghost, Stoner Frank, all those characters basically done by Sky would be gone or dead or, never gone to the same place and potentially being manipulated in more dangerous ways like Richard. But yeah, again, Richard was supposed to be the Michael of their world, so maybe the alternate timeline would have been perfectly fine with without Michael. Like maybe things went fine because yeah, again, it was stated that Richard it was supposed to be the Michael of the alternate timeline, so maybe the alternate timeline would have been fine because the alternate timeline goes two ways. Like it's either fine because of Richard, because he was meant to be the one to be Michael, or it's absolutely fudged and people are dead. As for one of the few characters that did have a main timeline um, variant being Ghost, seeing he had his werewolf uh, variant before they were combined together. Like, he may or may not face the same fate of death eventually, like the alternate timeline Ghost, who was, shot through the head and, you know, would have probably died without, Jimmy, you know, and, without a good Jimmy, because yeah, again, I'm mainly going off the premise there's no Michael, so there's still technically Jimmy, but Jimmy would have potentially not been a good Jimmy, probably been a bad Jimmy, honestly. So yeah, so for other ghosts, they probably would have suffered the same fate. Both ghosts would be dead and never been the god or enigma of death or aeon of death. I'm now using aeon for um, you know, certain reasons that I realized. Um, um, because I already did a whole character bit on it. Of why the change has come. But yeah, but yeah. So yeah, and what about certain other characters like Rogers, Stewart, Blue, and Jack, and Al, and all that, and Boop Boop? Well, yeah, again, that sort of splits into two timelines. The timeline where Rogers and the gang, still had Stu, and the one where Stu left. So, too many, I guess, scenarios because technically the alternate timeline is the one where Stuart split off, but there was also a whole other bunch of stuff, that made the alternate timeline. But now, um, Stuart leaving Rogers is technically the main timeline, even though originally in the main timeline it was Stuart staying with Rogers and all them for as long as it did go. But, things have changed, you know, because of Kim. But nonetheless, I don't think things will necessarily change that much where Stewart was with MD or without them because nonetheless the Foundation would have quickly you know apprehended Rogers, and they would have no reason to keep Stewart a part of them because whether Stewart stayed or not, like the devouring incident was before Rogers could stab and kill Stewart. So Stewart, either way, never would have had a chance to become half ghost like they did in the original main timeline. But obviously, it's not the original main timeline anymore. But still, um, either way, like things from that point onwards weren't being particularly different, whether they were at the other detective agency or stayed with MD. The main difference is that Stewart will have become, head detective, which will have probably even furthered Al's path to redemption, like, because probably the only reason Al did it in the first place is for Stewart, like, if you realistically think about it, like, why would he unless it was for Stewart? So Stewart's unless he was lying, but yeah, again, the original Rogers didn't go long enough to figure out if he was lying or not, and with his show, it seemed like seeing that he had his own show, the Al Show, um, you know, it seemed like he had actually chosen the state apart. So yeah, it seems like Al will never return to the League of Villains either way, most likely. Um, yeah, yeah, it doesn't really matter. So eventually, you know, Jack would join because, yeah, again, Jack was a part of a different unknown detective agency. And it'd be very funny if it was the same one that Stewart would end up joining in the end. Like, that would be pure irony. Like, because the lore of Jack is that Jack wasn't a part of MD but joined MD from another detective agency that was never seen. But now Stewart's, joining, has joined, a different detective agency. So it'd be pure funny irony if Detective Jack was from that same group. Like, it'd just be pure irony. Like, and who knows if Jack would have ever actually joined them without Rogers, because it seemed like Stewart needed all the help they could get. So, you know, I think, Jack, despite, how chaotic Rogers, was, joined because of Rogers, because they wanted to see what would happen. But without Rogers, it probably meant Jack would have stayed a part of whatever other detective agency it would be. So that means it would only be potentially in that split timeline where Stewart is leader of MD, only Stewart and Blue, because Boop Boop never really did much, and Boop Boop probably would have been contained too, where Boop Boop stayed in containment for long or not. They probably would have realized Boop Boop's very much like 343, and Boop Boop would have basically probably became the same case as, SCP 343, where I would imagine, like, Boop Boop would have loved chatting with, you know, the SCP Foundation, and would probably be quite content to stay there, you know, and help out the Foundation despite its morally grey actions. Because it doesn't, Boop Boop doesn't really have any choice, no matter which version of events we're going with. So yeah. So yeah, in one timeline it would just be uh, Stu and Blue. So not that many, honestly, for the MD Detective Agency. You know, and not to mention Blue, like, has his, past with killing people. So, you know, who knows what would have happened, but I would imagine Blue would have been, you know, you know, good Blue, not need a murder, and yeah, again, it was out of self-defense, so, it is what it is. But down the other timeline, if, Stuart left, it's not of any consequence. I'm just gonna imagine that Jack was a part of that other detective agency. So yeah. So yeah. That means once, Rogers was detained, MD would be basically defunct, and so if and when Stewart went to Noir, they probably still would have, um, at some point, especially if the other detective agency is the only one investigating paranormal events. It just makes it even more likely that Stewart would, return to Noir. That means Blue and the other version of events would have also joined them. So, yeah, honestly, you know, it. So yeah, and either way, like only two detectives were, and the MD detective agency that won't have lasted long. Like even with Blue being a smart detective, like it would have not been enough manpower for one detective agency, and they're yeah again they're facing off against their competition. The other group would have still existed. So I think either way, MD would disintegrate. It would disintegrate over time and be defunct either way. So I feel like nonetheless Stewart and Blue would end up in the same position. And not only they would have to worry about a more dangerous world, potentially, unless the Foundation actually, did their stuff. But yeah, again, without Michael, no Chaos Insurgency on the side of the Foundation or the global occult or whatever they're called, the Global Occult Coalition, whatever the hell, the GOC. Um, Neither of them would be a part of the Foundation, which means the Foundation's resources would be even less. So inevitably, when the Scarlet Queen finally does their plan, they probably would die. Not to mention Living Darkness. Like, the Foundation may have never been able to properly deal with Living Darkness, especially without the discovery of Void Essence and Abyss Essence. Like, they were lucky enough to capture one Living Darkness, actually, technically two, being one, the Dark Form, and two, the other floating Living Darkness lady that was in confinement scene, my world has combined with confinement, but yeah, like either way, they would have not had the resources for the Living Darkness. Even if they somehow beat the Scarlet Queen, they would still have to worry about, you know, the Living Darkness. And the Living Darkness, with everyone divided, probably could have won a lot more easily, especially with other threats that would have weakened up the Foundation, like Mikkel. So even if they beat Mikkel, Dimentio, like Oliver Bane, if he ever entered the picture, Salvador, even if the Foundation somehow beat all the odds, they would be extremely like wasted of their resources. Same for the GOC and Chaos Insurgency. Like they all would have been wasted of their resources over the many, many different threats there would have been. Not to mention if Jimmy is actually evil, like Jimmy like adds on to that. Meaning by the time Living Darkness strikes, the Foundation would be totally screwed. Like without Michael, Living Darkness I think would certainly win. Like the world would be engulfed in darkness. The darkness wins, like, and they rule, I guess, the multiverse potentially. You know, not to mention the Eye plan would have never worked. Daisy would have never came back into power, and a lot of other stuff. And Reslex may have never being able to atone for their sins, eternally trapped in watching paint dry the game's realm by Bonsai Boy and many other potential heroes never would have came to be. So yeah. So yeah. So I guess that answers the question of what if Michael was gone or Jimmy. Jimmy Jimmy has less of an impact, honestly. Like, yeah, again, Jimmy hasn't been the main player despite he was created before, Michael. But, yeah, so without Michael, the world would have fallen to darkness. And that means many people would have potentially had to suffer. You know, many heroes dead or defeated or crushed, and even if they did survive somehow, did eventually gain the knowledge of Void Essence and Abyss Essence, it would have probably been too late. Like, that knowledge would have potentially come too late. And it'd be only a few left fighting against darkness forever. Kind of like, Alan and his battle against, the dark presence. It'd be a very similar situation. The world would literally become the dark place in a way from like Alan Wake. And fittingly enough, without Michael would have never shown up to help out Alan. So one version of Alan Wake out there is potentially more eternally trapped than any other of the Allens. Like, one Alan potentially would have lost to the dark presence. So, yeah. Seeing that, once I learned, the dark presence is basically exactly the same to the living darkness I've created over the many years, I've been doing this, it it was like living darkness is the dark presence. Perfect parallel. But nonetheless, one Alan's dead out there, I guess. Potentially two with, the alternate timeline if that wasn't saved by Richard. So yeah. Michael is still probably the most important character and will continue to be the most important character in my story. So yeah. Without him, that what if would be chaos. But yeah. That'll do it for this video on what if. What if. Actually doing a what if on my own story. Have I earned the right to do it? I don't know. I don't know when a good point to do it would be, but I just decided now would be a better time than any, I suppose. But yeah. Anyway, that'll be it for the video. Peace and thank you.